Okay, you ain't got time to call your soul a critic. Lesson 24 of A Course in Miracles. I do not perceive my own best interests. I think before we get into the lesson, there's something I do want to say. Okay. As I do these and I post these, I'm getting, the responses that we get from whoever we get responses from are indicating some experiences that we're having, that people are having based on the doing of the lessons. But there's something that I wanted to add to that. I want you to understand that these lessons actually are cumulative, and we're still in the beginning stages. So the experience that we're having are all well and good. But remember, these lessons are work together in a particular way to bring about a different way of thinking in its entirety. And as you go along, you're going to have many, many experiences. And sooner or later, you're going to realize that not all of them are actually in line with the goal that we're ultimately trying to achieve. What we're trying to do with these lessons is undo your mind of the way you're thinking. So it might be helpful for somebody to go back and read the introduction again to see exactly what this is all about, that you don't have to understand them, you don't have to accept them, you just simply have to do them in the way that they're written. And I think one of the most important aspects of all this is many people attempt to try to understand the lesson before they actually do the lesson, in an attempt to do the lesson the right way. And that's all egoic thinking based on criticizing yourself as if you're going to do these right or wrong, and if you could get them right, they're going to have more benefit, as opposed to if you get them wrong, they're not going to have the right benefit. And I think that goes directly to the heart of what this lesson is talking about. I do not perceive my own best interests. If you have yet to understand the fact that these lessons work together cumulatively, so by the end you're thinking in an entirely different way, then the way that you approach the lessons is going to be based on the perception of the lessons that you have now, rather than just following the directions to find out what occurs later on. So I think, don't try to understand what these lessons are attempting to bring about in you. Don't try to understand the lesson before you do it. Just read it the way it's written, hear it the way you hear it, and apply it the way it's given to you. And we could take a perfect example is in the situation involving doing these lessons. I would like to have experiences of God happen, so that when that happens, I will feel freedom in my mind, so that when that happens, blah, 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 and you're down the road. When you don't quite know what it is you're actually perceiving. The fact that many of you attempt to understand these lessons is the recognition that you may not be perceiving these lessons quite correctly, because you haven't finished them and gotten to the desired outcome that the lessons are designed to bring about. But in your mind, you have an idea about what they're designed to bring about. But remember, prior to the undoing of your mind, the idea that you have about what the lessons are for is based on the misperceptions that you're holding about yourself now. So they can't possibly be true. Yet, we all have an idea of what we'd like to happen to us based on what the words we think we're reading now are saying, when we have yet to complete the exercises to show us what they're really for. And, to use a perfect, to me, and now I know that many of you are going to think I'm picking on people, but I assure you that's not the case. A perfect example is someone like Dr. Wapnick, who, upon reading A Course in Miracles and looking at it for 3 months, decides what it's supposed to say, why it's supposed to say it, and goes ahead and edits it in a particular way, having yet to do the lessons that would allow him to have undone his mind from what he was thinking so as to bring out a different result. And that's exactly what this lesson is bringing us to today. In no situation that arises do you realize the outcome that would make you happy, including the doing of these lessons. Therefore, you have no guide to appropriate action and no way of judging the result. What you do is determined by your perception of the situation. So if you're perceiving an outcome right now based on what you're reading before your mind has been undone, you're attempting to understand the lessons based on the past with an expectation of what should happen in the future, rather than just doing the lessons as it's designed right now and accepting what occurs to you without judgment. Now, part of this lesson is going to call for a bit more honesty than we have been accustomed to, which I think it's important to recognize. You're actually being asked to admit to honesty as to your own dishonesty, if you understand what I'm talking about. And maybe as we read the lesson a little more, you'll get what I'm saying. What you do is determined by your perception of the situation. And that perception is wrong. Notice it's not saying if it's this way it's wrong and if that's way it's right. It's saying at this moment in time, before the ego has been undone in its thinking, in its way of thinking, and therefore as your guide to the way that you operate, you have yet to perceive anything correctly. So it is inevitable then that you will not serve your own best interest, because you don't know what your best interest is in each and every situation. Ultimately, your best interest is you want to be happy. But not knowing what happiness is, and now the admission that you're not happy, otherwise you wouldn't be doing this, is important to recognize. It is inevitable then that you will not serve your own best interests. Yet, they are the only goal in any situation which is correctly perceived. So obviously what this is saying is the only goal you really have is to serve your own best interests. But not knowing what your best interest is and be in a position where your perceptions are all wrong, it's impossible for you to arrive at a true outcome. And that's what we need to recognize, so we stop imposing the limitations of our own mind on any given situation, because the outcome that we can get is based on the limitations that we impose. Yet they are your only goal in any situation which is correctly perceived. Otherwise, you will not recognize what they are. We're doing something for a desired outcome. Therefore, we're basing what we do on the outcome we desire. And if we don't know what our best interest is in regard to that outcome, it would be impossible to think correctly about it, so therefore it'd be impossible to act correctly in regards to it. If you realize that you do not perceive your own best interests, you could be taught what they are. But in the presence of your conviction that you do know what they are, you cannot learn. Period. Now, there's a point in time in A Course in Miracles when Jesus equates learning with life. Life and learning here are one. And there's a reason for that. When we open our minds in a true way of learning, we're opening our minds to the light and love of God, which is how we give our soul its daily bread. When we deny ourselves our daily bread, we starve ourselves of the light and love of God and start to wither away. We start to get old and sick and die. And these lessons are designed to help us learn how to open ourselves back up to that light so that we can achieve a goal and achieve it in the way that involves the least suffering for ourselves and therefore all the world. Our best interests are never served when we hold our interests in separation from our brother's interests. You know, a teacher of God is one who has perceived that his interests are not separate from his brother's. But in order to learn that, we must undo the ego's idea that there's something for us to get in order to protect ourselves, because all the ego is attempting to do in keeping us thinking that way is protect and preserve its necessity for you to identify with it, because it has no life of its own, and you give it its daily bread by attending to the interests that it asks you to perceive and serve, rather than the interests for a true outcome for the entirety of the brotherhood. We can call that the atonement or salvation. So today, when we do these exercises, we're going to acquire a little bit more honesty, much more honesty than you are accustomed to. A few subjects, honestly and carefully considered in each of the 5 practice periods, which should be undertaken today, will be more helpful than a cursory examination of a large number. And why? Because you want to see the associations that you have in your mind. And not only do you want to see the associations in your mind, you want to become familiar with how the egoic mind works, so as to see that it's leading you not to a true goal of peace of mind. It's leading you constantly to serve it rather than to serve the purposes of your soul in the ability to escape the world, because we're giving up attack thoughts. So, few subjects honestly and carefully considered in each of the 5 practice periods, which should be undertaken now, will be more helpful. 2 minutes instead of a minute are suggested for each of the mind-searching periods. And I think you're going to find, as this says, that as you consider the desired outcomes based on the perception that you have, you'll see that many of the desired outcomes have zero to do with what it is what actually you think your best interest is. You know, in a situation involving my job, I would like to switch my job so that I could move from where I live, so that I could find a place that has more space and has a yard, because I really think that my best interests are served by living in another place. Really. And in that, you could see what the purposes that you've really been serving, and how you're attempting to get an outcome that is being limited by the way in which you're thinking about the situation based on a perception that you've been told in the first paragraph is wrong. Now, these lessons are directing our mind to a new way of learning. Ultimately, I think it will be more and more easy to recognize that as we commend our spirit to the Father in each and every situation that we face, we will begin to see in a new way, because we will stop serving the purpose of the ego and keeping us from running from the truth, and begin to see how we have run from the truth. So as we can learn that we don't have to do it, and begin to recognize that all happiness comes from doing God's will rather than serving the purposes of the ego, which, as we are identified with it now on day number 24, still continues to want to lead us astray. Now, the idea of honesty in this is going to come up because we honestly really want to think that we're serving God's purpose. But the best way to understand the power of our mind is to recognize that this lesson is saying that we're not even serving our own best interests purpose, because we don't know what they are. And in the recognition of that, and in the recognition of the associations we make in our mind as to how we do that, we begin to shorten the time that it takes from getting from that initial questioning thought to a true answer, rather than wandering down the road and following the dictates of the ego in any given situation where we may perceive wrongly and yet not understand that the nature of our perception and the actions that we take are, in a sense, not useful for a true outcome, because we don't know how to get to a true outcome alone, because being alone is the problem. And the true outcome, where happiness no longer comes at the expense of anyone, and we begin to contribute to the ability for everyone to be happy, because we withdraw our faith in the ego and placing it totally in faith and surrender to the will of God, allows us to begin to feed our soul its daily bread. And in those moments of letting go of the outcome, and believe me, all the outcomes and all the perceptions that the ego would have us look at and follow are based on fear, rather than the totality of the reality that love is what we all are, and love is what we would all benefit from if we could learn the way to utilize our minds to extend love rather than project fear. So that's about all I'm going to say today about lesson number 24. And go forth and serve the Lord, or recognize that you have no idea. The best way to serve the Lord is to have no idea how to do it, yet be willing to learn and apply today's lesson to each and every situation where in which you begin to think along those lines. First, you're going to encounter a lot of confusion in your own mind. That's good. That's not bad. And I know confusion is the opposite of understanding, and we think that we're supposed to understand, yet we need to admit to the confusion and chaos that's in our minds. So therefore, in the world, as we perceive it, and therefore attempt to act in it to achieve anything at all. So our minds are chaotic because they're undisciplined. We're learning to see how undisciplined they are, how we allow that non-disciplined mind to operate, and the reason we allow that non-disciplined mind to continue to be a non-disciplined, so as to once and for all give up the ways of the world and allow ourselves to recognize the truth of who we are and who our brothers are, therefore healing our minds and becoming involved in the Great Crusade. Listen, learn, and do, so as to bring about a totality of resurrection of life and to see that there are no separate states. Heaven and earth are not separate states. They're one and the same because God is one, his goal is one, and his kingdom is one. So with that, go forth and have a great day.